After a year of judicial refinement, the Fair Labor Standards Act was established in 1938 by FDR. The law established a 25-cent minimum wage for employees in the production and interstate commerce industries. Since the FLSA's establishment, it has been changed 22 times by 12 different presidents. Then in 1961, the FLSA was amended to reach the retail industry, and again in 1968 to reach government employees. This next slide shows the wage set compared to today's value in red. The minimum wage has always been set below the poverty line, but the gap has risen from 1% in 1968 to 40% since 1989. The current minimum wage is $7.20.
So, some notable Supreme Court cases for the minimum wage. First one was Adkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923. So, some facts about the case. 1918, Congress passed a law for setting minimum wages for women and children in D.C. There was also previous decisions in Mueller versus Oregon in 1908 and Bunting versus Oregon in 1917 that did not overrule the holding in Lochner versus New York in 1905, which that case was about the protection of freedom of contract. And the freedom of contract is basically freedom of private or public individuals and groups to form contracts without government restrictions. These were different from what this case was different from what the previous ones were. The past ones were about maximum amount of hours. The present was about minimum wage. So the holding for this case was that the minimum wage law for women violated the due process right to freedom of contract. This was affirmed by the D.C. Court of Appeals. The majority of the justices were Sutherland, McKenna, Van Devanter, McReynolds, and Butler. And Sutherland wrote the majority opinion. And then the dissent was Taft, Sanford, and Holmes. And Taft and Holmes both wrote a dissenting opinion. But Brandeis took no part in this case. And the laws used in this case were the U.S. Constitution Amendments 5 and 19, and then the minimum wage law of D.C. in 1918. Another one was that this one overruled the Adkins case. This is called West Coast Hotel Company versus Parrish, and this happened in 1937. It was a case about upholding constitutionality of minimum wage legislation. This, in part, ended the Lochner era. This was a period in legal history of America where Supreme Court tended to invalidate legislation aimed at regulating businesses. This was also during the Great Depression era, and some more facts about the case were Elsie Parrish, chambermaid working at the Cascadian Hotel in Wenatchee, Washington, with her husband. She sued the hotel for the difference between what she was paid, and she was paid $14.50 per week of 48 hours. And this was the minimum wage established by Industrial Welfare Committee and Supervisor of Women in Industry, according to Washington state law. The trial court used Adkins as precedent and ruled for defendant. Then the Washington Supreme Court, taking as direct appeal, reversed the trial court to find in favor of Parrish. The hotel appealed, and then this is when it went to the Supreme Court. So the holding for the case was that Washington's minimum wage law for women was a valid regulation of the right to contract freely because of the state's special interest in protecting their health and ability to support themselves. The majority justices were Hughes, Brandeis, Stone, Roberts, and Cardozo, and Hughes wrote for the majority opinion. And then Sutherland, Van Devanter, McReynolds, and Butler. And Sutherland wrote the dissenting opinion for the dissent. Then the laws applied for this case were the U.S. Constitution Amendment 14, and then the other one was Minimum Wages for Women Act in 1913. This was a case that helped switch the viewpoint of minimum wage and also gave way for FDR to enact the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938.
One proposition for increasing the minimum wage is that more money for low-wage workers would allow them to spend it on goods and services, thus stimulating the economy. A recent study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago concluded that, following an increase in the minimum wage, spending by households with at least one minimum wage worker increased by $700 per quarter. Also, more workers would get over the poverty line because currently only a full-time single worker with no dependents who works 52 weeks in a year can earn enough to get over the poverty line. A higher minimum wage might also decrease turnover and thus keep training costs down for employers. An article from Forbes, which presents an alternative way of looking at the issue, states the goal of the minimum wage law is not to raise or lower unemployment, nor should it because evidence suggests that it really can't. Its purpose is social. It is meant, just like many other laws, to protect those who might not have the power or resources to be able to protect themselves. Even Adam Smith, a pioneer of free market economics, said this: "What are the common wages of labor depends everywhere upon the contract usually made between those two parties, whose interests are by no means the same. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor." This quote illustrates a lot of the contemporary thinking in which there is more emphasis on protecting the worker from exploitation and less on the economic side effects of a minimum wage. Another proposition is that higher wages would reduce income inequality and shrink the increasing wage gap between the rich and the poor. A new Rasmussen Reports national telephone survey finds that just 20% of American adults want the minimum hourly wage in their state to stay at $7.25. 74% want it to be higher, but that includes only 12% who prefer the $15 level. 3% think their state's minimum wage should be even higher than that. These statistics also include a percentage of recent Trump supporters and other conservatives who would also like to see a raise from $7.25. An increased minimum wage would mean that the living wage could be equal to or less than the increased minimum wage. Also, a higher minimum wage would increase worker productivity, as the employees would have a greater motivation to work and perception of fairness, as well as an improved focus to do their jobs. Lastly, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that an increase would benefit over 28 million American workers. 19 million of those would benefit directly, while another 9 million would indirectly benefit from the ripple effect of a shifting wage structure.
Although there are many different arguments made by those who are opponents to raising the minimum wage, there are four main arguments that are consistently made. The first main argument is that raising the federal minimum wage will result in job loss. This is based on the idea that if employers are having to pay higher wages, they won't be able to afford to continue paying all of their employees, thus having to lay some of them off. A 2006 study conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that approximately two-thirds of the 100 minimum wage studies that were analyzed found negative employment effects from raising the minimum wage. After that study was conducted, a 2010 study by the Southern Economic Journal estimated that nearly 1.3 million jobs would be lost if the federal minimum wage was increased to $9.50 per hour. In addition to the studies about job loss and the minimum wage, is the recent example that is used about American Samoa. There were recently minimum wage increases in American Samoa that were imposed between 2007 and 2009 that affected the economy in such a poor way that President Obama had to sign a bill into law that postponed the wage hikes. Another main argument of opponents is that a wage increase will hurt low-skilled workers. A 2010 analysis from Michael Hicks at Ball State University found that due to the latest round of minimum wage increases between 2007 and 2009 has led to a major decrease in employment, particularly with low-skilled workers. According to his study, the wage hikes led to roughly 550,000 fewer part-time jobs, which included approximately 310,000 fewer teenagers working part-time. In addition to job loss and hurting low-skilled workers, another argument is that the federal minimum wage increase will have little effect on reducing poverty. This is because a small portion of the U.S. workforce that would receive a pay increase live in poor households. Based on a report written by Mark Wilson in 2012 for the Cato Institute, with the previous minimum wage increases, only 15% of the workers receiving pay increase lived in poor households. In the same study, Wilson found that if the minimum wage was increased today to $9.50, only 11% of workers who live in poverty would receive a pay increase.
The final main argument made by opponents to raising the minimum wage is that it may result in higher overall prices for consumers. This is due to the fact that raising the minimum wage would increase the overall amount that a good would cost to be made, causing the prices of goods purchased by consumers to rise. Also, in Wilson's study in 2012, he mentions how in a 2004 study there was a comprehensive review of more than 20 minimum wage studies that found that with a 10% increase in the U.S. minimum wage, it would raise food prices by up to 4%.
29 states plus the District of Columbia have minimum wage standards higher than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Many states are looking to increase minimum wages from current standards. This would help close the gap between minimum wage and the living wage. If the state law is higher than the federal minimum wage, the higher wage is enforced. In the United States, both living wage and minimum wage help to ensure the minimum amount workers can or should be paid to protect the working poor. But even though both are ways to regulate the minimum payments to workers, they differ in their fundamentals and what goes into determining them. Living wage is really a representation of the minimum amount of payment that you could support yourself and your family off of. This includes the basic expenses of living determined based on where you live. This information is helpful for many reasons, and economists and policymakers use it to help analyze the financial health which people use to define a person's financial status or well-being on multiple different levels. Using the living wage to compare workers' living costs helps to show if a person is really even being paid enough to support their lifestyle. But this information is mostly for analytical purposes and put towards cities' decisions regarding living wages. Unlike minimum wage, there is no actual federal living wage law, but there are 120 plus cities that have established some form of living wage laws that relate to government contract employers. Minimum wage is a federal law brought about through the Fair Labor Standards Act and state and local government law. This makes it illegal for any employer to pay their worker any less than $7.25 per hour, which is also labeled as $15,080 for a full-time year-round worker. States can make adjustments to the federal law, but the employers have to pay whichever wage is higher in their location. The key differences between the two is that minimum wage does not take into consideration the specific costs for different locations of living. Food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and other necessities are all taken into consideration for living wage calculations, but not for minimum wage. Minimum wage is more based off of the economy and business interests as a whole. Minimum wage affects earnings on an individual level, whereas living wage takes various household sizes into consideration. Living wage is not really enforced unless the company has a contract with the state or local government that sets one, whereas minimum wage is highly regulated by the U.S. Department of Labor within the federal government, or by the state and local governments if they made adjustments. Many people believe that it is time to make the minimum wage representative of the living wage. It seems like it is logical to make the minimum worker payment the minimum amount that they need to support themselves and their family. But many other factors go into determining this, and brings about the topic of conversation that we covered earlier, whether to raise or lower the minimum wage. For the working poor, it is possible to go to the living wage calculator online and even move to areas that have a set living wage that aligns with their lifestyle and home needs to get the closest salary range you need. Otherwise, this will always be highly disputed on whether or not minimum wage should match the living wage.